Professor Paul Goddard, thank you for agreeing to a fourth interview with me.
David, thank you for interviewing me. It's very kind.
Today, I'd like to ask you about your latest book, The Death of Science.
Ah, yes, The Death of Science.
Why does
this
it
one.
have such a somber title? And what prompted you to write such a book?
Well, The Death of Science is because I think that what's been happening to science recently is a very serious subject. And what prompted me to write this was that Professor Angus Dalgleish and myself were talking about the way that science has been affected by money, politics, and this was particular with regard to COVID. And I told my brother this, and I said, "Do you know, I think it's the death of science." And he said, "That has to be the title of your next book." So 10 of us got together, and it's taken the 10 of us to write it. I mean, it's not just Gus and myself, it was 10 of us, yeah.
So, quite a few chapters are primarily by yourself and by Angus Dalgleish. And you provide chapters on philosophy of science, COVID and the response to it, nutrition, physics, climate change, the legal position. I mean, that's quite a spread for a slim book.
Well, yes, it is indeed, and it would be nice to be able to go into greater depth. Certainly, let's talk about for a second the philosophy of science. That was written in conjunction with my two sons, who are both very interested in this subject and have a couple of degrees between them, including a BSc in architecture and an MA in philosophy.
Wow.
So we've got not just ourselves, as I said. Why such a spread? Because once we'd written the first couple of chapters, it was then important to give people examples and to explain via the examples why we thought that science is in danger in what you can call the postmodern world.
Nutrition?
Yes, nutrition is one of the worst areas, isn't it? Because every few weeks you get something in the newspapers telling you that the way to live forever is to eat beans, or to take fat out of your diet completely, or you'll have somebody saying the answer is just to eat meat and nothing, no carbohydrates. Yeah, all the time there are people saying conflicting things about nutrition. And so that was an interesting subject to talk about, and try to pick out some of the science that does work, but also point out some of the things that have to be wrong. When you've got so many different people giving you different views, clearly they don't really know, because they can't all be right.
Yeah. Sir Richard Dearlove has written the last chapter. Why so?
Well, Sir Richard Dearlove is a very interesting character, and I think I could just read you a little bit from the back of the book here, where we say who he was and still is. Sir Richard Dearlove, KCMGOBE, had a successful and distinguished career in government and education. He joined MI6 in 1966. And he became eventually the chief of the Secret Intelligence Service. Now that is, if this were James Bond, and I just point out it's not, but if this were James Bond, that is M. In fact, he was never called M. They never called the person in charge of MI6 M. That was Ian Fleming having fun. They always called him C for controller. He was the controller of the spies. Now, so how did he get involved? Well, he was also the chair of the board of the trustees of London University from August 2014. And Gus Dalgleish, Professor Dalgleish, emeritus professor now from St George's, he talked to Sir Richard Dearlove about this project, and he said, "Yes, I'll write something for you. You can use it any way you like." And so he wrote what he wrote, and we made it the last chapter. And I think it's a very important chapter because he says things like, good science is not about a certain and vested interest. It has always been underwritten by transparent and thorough debate and analysis, and a willingness to admit mistakes. However, alleged scientific certainty is today being scandalously exploited to serve a perception of truth.
Wow.
And this is the sort of thing he's putting in here. And he completely endorses our ideas about this, whilst also pointing out that saying that science is dead is not true. I mean, science isn't dead. We're talking about what could happen and what we want not to happen. We don't want science to die.
What a wonderful contributor.
Yes.
Thank you.
The others, I have to say, are very important people as well in their own aspects, and they write very well.
A wonderful assembly. You have a very controversial stance on the COVID origin, the lockdowns, and the vaccines. Are you an anti-vaxxer?
Now, that's an interesting question. Let me just start off by saying that some of what we've said has now become mainstream. When I tell people now, well, of course, the COVID was made in the laboratory, they say, yeah, well, of course it was. And they forget that just a little while ago they were shouting at me and saying that I was a conspiracy theorist. Am I an anti-vaxxer? The answer is I had both AstraZeneca vaccine and I had the booster from Pfizer.
Okay.
So you can't say that I'm an anti-vaxxer, but am I anti these vaccines? Yes. I'm anti these vaccines because they weren't tested properly. They are not vaccines. I like to say vaccines like that with inverted commas, because they are actually gene therapy. And just give you an example of myself, I caught the COVID very early on in the January of 2020 from a Chinese friend who came to visit us, was over from China. We definitely, both myself and my wife, had the COVID then. We didn't catch it again until we'd been vaccinated 3 times. And since then, we've caught it 4 times. 4 times after we'd been vaccinated 3 times. In the meantime, there had been 3 or 4 waves of this pandemic all around the world and all around where we live. We were fine until we were heavily vaccinated.
Okay.
I've looked into it. The vaccine is not fit for purpose. It wasn't looked at properly. It was rushed through on vaccine legislation rather than drug and gene therapy legislation, so they cheated. They tried to hide away from this. Particularly Pfizer, for example, wanted all of the reactions hidden for 75 years or something ridiculous.
75 years?
Yes.
What purpose does that serve apart from suppression of
It's suppression of information. That's all it was. That's all it was. Suppression. It's shocking. I have to say that the AstraZeneca people came straight out and said, we think there is a problem, and agreed originally. And then in court, they tried to deny it.
And Paul, all of this is in the COVID and the response to it chapter in The Death of Science.
Yes, it's all in there. And also, I'll tell you what is in there that most people are not aware of. Let's go back to this origin business. What was happening? What was happening when the virus escaped? And I'll tell you exactly what was happening. They had made the COVID, and they made it by using coronaviruses they got from bats. They had 200 different coronaviruses that they were playing around with, and they had made it, and they had made vaccines. And they were testing the vaccines on political prisoners. They were injecting the vaccines, and then they were challenging them with the virus. And of course, the vaccines weren't perfect, and quite a lot of the people actually caught the virus, including the investigators. Now, the Chinese, with their political prisoners, they don't care if their political prisoners die, but they do care if their investigators do. So the investigators went down to the main hospital. Down at the main hospital, they realized there was a problem and got in touch with the Chinese authorities, who told them to keep quiet. So this is not something where the Chinese authorities were caught out by surprise. They knew what was happening, and they purposely kept it quiet.
Wow. On another of the chapters, on climate change,
Oh yes, climate change, yes.
you say that climate science has become too politicized. What is your evidence for that, and how does it affect the way you believe that we should look at global warming? Two different things, climate change and global warming.
Well, they might be two different things. They've tried to tell us they're the same thing, haven't they?
Okay.
Of course, I think it's important to realize that when they say climate change, they also often say global warming. Here's an evidence of global warming. Why do I think it's politicized? Well, because if you say I don't believe that global warming is occurring, or I don't believe it's all due to CO2, you will be called a climate change denier. And I don't deny that there is climate change. And I don't know any scientists who actually do deny that there's climate change, because there always is climate change. And what happens is that the climate goes through great big cycles. And what is happening at the moment is we're going through a cycle which is a little bit warmer than it has been. Of course, we had a mini ice age around 1800, 1750 to about 1820, a mini ice age, and it's been warming up a little bit since then. But actually, if you look at the planet over the 4 billion years that the planet's been here, it's actually quite cold at the moment. Right, so we have these enormous cycles, and then within these big cycles there are mini cycles, and this is what we're looking at the moment. And this is due to slight changes in our orbit and changes in the sun.
Okay. So you also mentioned particular dates when you start to collect your data and make comparisons from. Was it 1979
Yes.
you mentioned?
Yes. You see, if you want to cheat with statistics, what you do is you can cut your graph off at certain places, and you might actually try to make this look much more dramatic than it is by taking the top and the bottom off and just showing, oh, there's a very steep reduction, in the amount of ice in the Arctic. And you ignore the fact that you started off at a point where it's been the highest for many years, and that when it started to come back up, you don't show that. You just show that little bit. This is a typical way of behaving. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have change due to our bad behavior as human beings. We do, but these are local changes. So if you cut down the rainforest, you'll end up with the desert. So if you cut down the Amazon, you'll end up with the desert. And they did this, of course, in the south of North America, and they called it the Dust Bowl. That's because they cut down loads of trees and the scrub and everything, and then they just planted monoculture and ended up with it. Now, why? Why does that happen? Because trees are very important for several reasons. It's not just the transpiration and the pulling of the water out from the ground. It is also because the particles that come off from the trees, they seed the clouds. Without the trees there, there's no transpiration, there's no seeding of the clouds, you don't have any rain. Without rain, you end up with a desert.
Fascinating. So in this situation of change to the orbit and change to the sun's output, what should we be doing about that in the context of the next 20 years or so? Do we just live with it?
Yes, there's nothing for us to do about that.
Wow.
We have to accept that the changes come and go. What, though, would be important is for people to actually look at these changes and make better predictions, because these are the sort of changes that can be predicted. And climatologists are purposely ignoring them because it spoils the argument. Their argument is that it's all due to CO2. We must control the use of fossil fuels and that'll save the planet. This is nonsense.
Okay, that's pretty challenging.
Yes, of
and
course.
Controversial, what you just said. You mentioned climatologists. A climatologist and a meteorologist, hard to say that. they're not the same thing anymore. Or
No,
were they?
well, you see, the meteorologists were the people who did the weather forecasting, and the departments of meteorology have all been taken over by climatologists because that is where the money is. Huge amounts of money have been made available by governments, and surprisingly, some of this has been pushed by the very people you think wouldn't push it, the petrochemical companies. But hey, have a look. Who are making the huge profits right now? Who are making the big profits? Now, here's one interesting fact. Carbon trading. Who invented carbon trading? BP. Why? Well, because with carbon trading, if you use a lot of fossil fuel, you have to pay for the carbon trading. If you don't use much, but you have a big organization, you get money from carbon trading. Well, BP, Shell, and all these other companies, they don't use oil. They just suck it out the ground. They don't use much. So they've done very well out of carbon trading. There's
So you say they don't use much, but they still get the payments.
Well, they don't use it. They get payments from the big organisations that do. Which big organisation do you think in the UK had to pay the most because of carbon trading? Who do you think?
Go on, tell me.
It's the NHS. So that's you and me, it's the taxpayer. So what actually really happened with carbon trading was the taxpayer put more money into the pockets of BP and Shell and such like. No wonder they like it.
Fascinating, Paul. I mean, this is just a couple of chapters we've had a look at. The book has been a #1 bestseller on Amazon ever since Christmas. To what do you attribute its success?
Well, I think we've hit the timing right. People are just beginning to change their views. What I'm hoping is that this isn't just a political thing, because I personally am very much a middle of the road person with regards to politics. And I'm quite happy at local elections, for example, to vote Green. And I hope that people aren't saying, oh, you're just a right-winger and it's a populist viewpoint. No, what I'm saying is I don't want people to believe the things that I say. I want them to test them.
Nice. Yeah. Wonderful. And so they're reading the book, and do you feel that they are testing some of the things in the book?
I think that, yes, I think that what's happening is that people are beginning to change their attitudes, and that there is a feeling that things will change. Doctors, for example, have been kept quiet about the vaccines and the problems with the vaccines. That's beginning to change. I've met a lot of doctors recently who are saying, no, we now must say something. And this is despite the fact that they're being held down and told not to say anything.
Fascinating. On your website, it describes The Death of Science as a serious read about the retreat from reason in the postmodern world. And it's all about the politicization and monetization of science.
Yes.
I'm sure you want to say a little bit more about that, or maybe ask people to read the book. Are you a doctor or a scientist?
Well, I'm both, you see, and in the past, all medical doctors who went on particularly into the hospital services and especially into the teaching hospitals, they had to write a lot of scientific papers. They had to learn a lot about statistics. I did also do a degree in pharmacology as an intercalated degree, and so I can claim that I have a pure science degree as well as having medical degrees, and I did an MD. And this was typical for my generation of hospital doctors. Typical. It is not typical now. Now, it is not expected that a consultant will write even a single paper.
Wow. Okay. In the context then of something like the COVID problem, is there the Hippocratic Oath, you mentioned before that you're not sure if the Hippocratic Oath is still relevant. What is it? That's what doctors take when they
Yes, not
when
all
they
doctors.
become, not all.
Not all doctors take an oath as such, but they are taught ethics.
Okay.
And the prime thing from the Hippocratic Oath that we should all remember is first, do no harm. And I think that should really be true for all scientists.
Okay. And there is no such thing as a Hippocratic Oath type guidance in science, is there?
Well, there certainly are ethics that people are expected to adhere to, which were developed because of the atrocities in the Second World War, and they came out of the Nuremberg trials, etc. And these involve things like informed consent. People should not be asked to take part in experiments without full informed consent. What has happened with the COVID vaccines, and again I put in the inverted commas, is that there was no informed consent. And certainly for the first two AstraZeneca ones, I do not remember seeing any leaflet or any information or being told anything. On the third one, which was the Pfizer, there was one leaflet. There was a queue of 100 people, one leaflet, and you weren't allowed to keep it. So we photographed it because it was impossible to read it in the time. They said, this is the leaflet. If you want to know about it, here's that. Right, I want to know about it.
Terrible.
So when they say, oh, it's all in the leaflets, these leaflets and this information was not available for the common public.
Understood.
It might have been available if you knew to look it up, where to look it up, etc. So as a defense, which AstraZeneca recently used it as a defense as to why they shouldn't pay damages for people who, they admit that their AstraZeneca vaccine was causing venous thrombosis, but they say it's in the leaflet.
Ooh.
Now, and a lot of people have had to drop out of their lawsuits because of that. Well, yes, but was the leaflet really available? That is the question that I ask.
Understood.
Yeah.
You have been described as a maverick
Yes.
in the past, and you also say, listen to the maverick views, otherwise science won't progress. So, of course, something like the GMC is involved in trying to suppress malpractice. You were also concerned about direct censorship and intimidation of medical doctors, particularly mavericks like yourself. You mentioned that the GMC has been taken over by the government. Previously, the membership of the GMC used to be elected by doctors themselves.
Well,
so there's a level of censorship and intimidation going on around the whole COVID.
yes, not just from the GMC, but also by the employers. And all hospital doctors now have line managers above them. In the past, consultants were their own managers. They were in charge. They aren't. They are not now. The consultants now have line managers above them, leading up to the chief executive of the hospital, and from there to the chairman of the trust, and from there to the Department of Health, and from the Department of Health up to the Prime Minister. So there's a direct line.
Yeah.
There's a direct line to the Prime Minister. And the truth of the matter is that the GMC and the employers work together now. And the GMC is not just there to protect the patients or to make sure that the doctors do the very best for the patients. That used to be the role of the GMC and was specifically that when the doctors used to be voted on to it. The doctors still pay for the GMC, surprisingly enough, because it's now been taken over completely by the government, and they they put in place ex-civil servants to run it. at a recent meeting, I asked the GMC representative who was talking to us, how can you justify preventing doctors from speaking their minds about subjects that they think are important for the health of their patients? How can you justify preventing free speech? Oh, no, we don't do that. No. And then he said, mind you, we can't allow them to tell people not to have vaccines. There was a howl from the doctors in the meeting because that is exactly the problem. They won't allow doctors to speak out about a subject which they know a lot about because they've seen the number of reactions that people are getting. A lot of people are getting reactions from the vaccines, and that's a problem. So doctors are beginning to speak out, and they will. I can predict that in a very short space of time, a lot of doctors will be coming forward and saying this is wrong. Other healthcare workers will too, because you can shut people up for a while, but eventually they will speak out. Now, why am I able to speak out? That's because I struck myself off from the GMC years ago, and I do not have to listen to the dictates of the diktats and dictates of the GMC. They mean nothing to me anymore.
Fascinating. And for science and medicine to progress, it requires people to think outside of the box and to challenge the accepted rules and the status quo.
Yes.
And if you don't have those people doing that, you don't have an advancement, do you?
You don't, and that's absolutely true.
What are your plans? Do you have a new book coming up?
Well, interestingly enough, although we say that The Death of Science is my latest book, it's not, actually. My latest book is an introduction to playing the blues.
Oh, fantastic.
And I have another one as well, which is how to make your own slide guitar.
And is this all guitar related, or playing the blues on the piano as well?
It's, well, actually, you can look at that. It's playing on the jazz slide guitar, but when you look at it, you realize it tells you how to play the blues on the piano if you can read music.
Because you're quite some blues pianist, aren't you?
Yes.
And you sing as well?
Yeah, well, some people call it that.
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
Great.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll just show you one of my guitars, shall I,
Thank
before
you.
we finish? Which one would you like me to show you? Perhaps the King Charles III. King Charles III, there he is.
Absolutely. Oh, look at
Look
the spoon.
that. There's a spoon on
And a
it.
ruler as well. Amazing. Well, thank you very, very much. What fun.
Cheers. Thank you.